Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
One strange lunch changed everything. Have you ever wanted to give up learning English because every sentence felt too fast, every conversation sounded impossible, and every mistake made you wonder if you would ever belong? What if I told you that one of the biggest turning points in my life did not happen in an English classroom, inside a university, or during an expensive language course? It happened because my American boss looked at a strange egg on my lunch plate, smiled with complete confidence, and said, "I'll try it." None of us knew that a single bite of Balut would begin a story about culture, family, love, confidence, and a new life in the United States. Stay with me until the end, because this is not only a slow English story for listening practice. It is also proof that sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest changes. My name is Alex, and this story happened a few years after I moved to the United States. If you are learning English, relax. Take a slow breath. Listen carefully. Every sentence is simple. Every idea is clear. This story is made for slow English reading, slow English listening, and speaking practice. You do not need to understand every word. Just enjoy the journey. When I first arrived in America, everything looked exciting from the outside. The streets were wide. The supermarkets were huge. The coffee cups were almost the size of small buckets. People smiled at strangers. They asked, "How are you?" even when they kept walking before I could answer. At first, I thought everyone wanted to become my friend. Later, I learned it was simply part of everyday American culture. But behind my smile, I was scared. Every morning before work, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and practiced simple English sentences. Good morning. How was your weekend? I'm working on a report. I repeated them again and again. The strange thing was that I could say every sentence perfectly when I was alone. Then I walked into the office. Someone spoke quickly, everyone laughed, and suddenly my brain forgot almost every English word I had ever learned. Scientists often explain that stress affects working memory. When people become nervous, the brain spends more energy managing fear instead of processing language. That means many English learners are not actually forgetting English. They are simply feeling too anxious to use it naturally. When I discovered this later, I stopped blaming myself so much. Still, back then, every workday felt like climbing a mountain. My office was full of friendly people. They came from different states across America. Some loved baseball. Some talked about camping every weekend. Others argued about barbecue like it was a national emergency. Everyone had stories. Everyone laughed easily. Except me. I smiled a lot. I nodded even more. Sometimes I laughed 2 seconds after everyone else because I needed extra time to understand the joke. If you have ever experienced that feeling, you already know how lonely it can be. Then came Friday. Every Friday, our office held a shared lunch. Everyone brought food from home or bought something special from a local restaurant. It was more than eating together. It was where friendships grew. The first few weeks, I only brought a sandwich. Nothing special. Nothing interesting. Nothing that invited questions. I wanted to stay invisible. Then one evening, my mother called me. She asked the question every immigrant probably hears sooner or later. Are you eating well? I laughed. I think so. She laughed louder. No. Real food. A few days later, I visited an Asian grocery store. Walking through those familiar aisles felt like stepping into another world. I heard languages from home. I smelled familiar spices. Suddenly, I missed my family more than ever. That was when I saw it. Balut. One small egg. One very unusual food. For many people in Southeast Asia, Balut is completely normal. It reminds us of childhood, family gatherings, late-night street food, and conversations with people we love. But I also knew that many Americans considered it one of the strangest foods in the world. I smiled. Then I had a crazy idea. What if I bring this to Friday lunch? The next morning, I almost changed my mind at least 10 times. What if everyone laughs? What if they think I'm weird? What if my boss thinks I'm unprofessional? Fear is funny. It can convince us that people are thinking about us every second. The truth is much simpler. Most people are too busy worrying about themselves. I placed the container carefully inside my lunch bag. All morning, I could barely focus on work. Then lunch arrived. People gathered around the long table. Someone brought homemade chili. Someone ordered pizza. Someone baked chocolate cookies. Everything smelled wonderful. Then I slowly opened my container. The room became surprisingly quiet. One coworker looked curious. Another looked confused. Someone whispered, "What is that?" Before I could answer, I heard another voice behind me. It was my boss. He walked closer, looked at the egg, smiled, and asked the question that completely changed my life. "So, what's the story behind this food?" Not, "That's weird." Not, "Why would anyone eat that?" Not even, "I'm leaving." Instead, he wanted the story. At that exact moment, I realized something important. People are often more interested in our stories than our perfection. I took a deep breath. Slowly, carefully, in simple English. I began explaining what Balut meant to me, where it came from, why families enjoyed it, and why it reminded me of home. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Everyone listened. Then my boss surprised the entire office. He smiled, picked up the egg, looked directly at me, and said 5 simple words that I will never forget. "I think I'll try it." And just like that, one strange lunch became the beginning of a friendship, a lesson about courage, and the first chapter of a story that would eventually lead me to love, marriage, children, and a life in America that I never imagined possible. But what happened after my boss took that first bite was something none of us could have predicted. My first days in America were nothing like the movies. If you think the hardest part of moving to America is speaking English, let me tell you a secret that almost nobody talks about. English is not the first thing that breaks your confidence. Silence is. The silence after someone tells a joke you do not understand. The silence when everyone finishes introducing themselves while you are still translating the first sentence inside your head. The silence during the drive home when you replay every conversation, wondering if you sounded strange. Looking back now, I realize I was never truly fighting the English language. I was fighting the fear of not belonging. Ironically, that fear almost stopped me from discovering the greatest friendships, the love of my life, and the family I would eventually build here in the United States. When my airplane landed in America, I expected my life to change overnight. Social media had filled my imagination with beautiful skylines, smiling neighbors, perfect jobs, and endless opportunities. In many ways, those things were real. America was exciting. The roads seemed endless. Every grocery store looked enormous. Every coffee shop had people working on laptops. Every neighborhood felt like a scene from a movie I had watched years before. But nobody had prepared me for the invisible challenge waiting behind every smile. People spoke fast. Very fast. Not textbook English. Not classroom English. Real English. Words blended together until entire sentences sounded like one very long sound. During my first week at work, my coworkers welcomed me warmly. They smiled, shook my hand, and introduced themselves one after another. "Nice to meet you. Glad you're here. Let me know if you need anything." I understood almost every individual word. But somehow, when those words came together naturally, my brain froze. Scientists who study second language learning explain something interesting. The human brain processes familiar language automatically, but a new language requires much more mental effort. Add stress, unfamiliar surroundings, and the desire to make a good first impression, and your brain suddenly becomes overloaded. It is not a lack of intelligence. It is cognitive overload. Once I understood that, I stopped thinking something was wrong with me. Still, understanding the science did not make Monday mornings easier. Every morning, I arrived 15 minutes early. Not because I loved being early, because I needed those quiet minutes. I would sit alone with my coffee and silently review simple English phrases. How was your weekend? I'm doing well. Can you repeat that, please? Could you speak a little slower? Those sentences became my safety net. One afternoon, my manager asked everyone to join a short meeting. Simple enough. At least I thought so. People began discussing a new project. Ideas flew across the room. Everyone interrupted each other politely. Everyone laughed. Someone made a joke about deadlines. The room exploded with laughter. I smiled too. 3 seconds later, unfortunately, everyone noticed. One coworker looked at me kindly and asked, "Did you get the joke?" I smiled honestly. Not really. Instead of laughing at me, she explained it slowly. That tiny moment changed something inside me. I had spent weeks pretending to understand everything. Pretending was exhausting. Asking was liberating. From that day forward, I started saying 4 magical words. Could you say that again? Nobody became angry. Nobody rolled their eyes. In fact, most people slowed down immediately. Some even apologized for speaking too quickly. That surprised me. I had imagined everyone expected perfect English. The truth was completely different. Most people simply wanted communication, not perfection. There was another challenge I never expected. American small talk. Back home, conversations usually had a purpose. In America, conversations often began with weather, sports, dogs, weekend plans, or coffee. One morning someone asked me, "Big plans this weekend?" I answered honestly, "No." Then I walked away. Several hours later, I realized the conversation had not ended because of my English. It ended because I did not know the culture. Later, I learned that American small talk is not about exchanging important information. It is about creating comfort, building trust, showing friendliness. That lesson was worth more than memorizing 100 vocabulary words. Slowly, I began observing everything around me. People thanked bus drivers. Cashiers smiled at customers. Neighbors waved while walking their dogs. Coworkers often ate lunch together instead of alone. These little habits taught me just as much English as any grammar book. Language and culture were never separate. They always traveled together. Every evening after work, I practiced differently. Instead of memorizing difficult vocabulary, I replayed real conversations from my day. I repeated simple sentences aloud. Sometimes I even recorded myself speaking. At first, hearing my own voice felt uncomfortable. Then something surprising happened. Week after week, I noticed tiny improvements. Not dramatic. Not magical. Just small. But small improvements repeated every day become enormous over time. Psychologists often describe this as the power of incremental learning. Our brains strengthen neural connections through repetition and meaningful experiences. Real conversations activate memory much more effectively than isolated vocabulary lists. Looking back, I unknowingly built confidence one ordinary conversation at a time. Friday eventually became my favorite day. Not because the weekend was coming, because Friday meant our office lunch. I loved watching everyone bring food from different backgrounds. Italian pasta, Mexican tacos, Texas barbecue, California salads, homemade cookies. Every meal carried a story. Every recipe carried a family tradition. Without realizing it, those lunches were teaching me another important lesson. Food was a language too. You did not need perfect grammar to explain why a dish reminded you of your grandmother. You only needed sincerity. As the next Friday approached, I looked inside my refrigerator and remembered the ballot I had bought earlier that week. Immediately, my heart started beating faster. Part of me wanted to leave it at home forever. Another part whispered something different. If people can share their stories, maybe it's finally your turn. I stood in my kitchen holding the container for several minutes. I imagined every possible disaster. My coworkers laughing. My boss looking uncomfortable. People refusing to sit near me. Fear always tells dramatic stories. Reality is usually much kinder. I placed the ballot into my lunch bag, zipped it closed, looked into the mirror one more time, and smiled nervously. I had absolutely no idea that by lunchtime, my American boss would make a decision that would completely change the way I saw English, friendship, and even my future life in America. The lunch table became my English classroom. Nobody warned me that the best English teacher in America would not stand in front of a whiteboard. There would be no grammar test, no vocabulary quiz, and no expensive textbook. Instead, my classroom would be a noisy lunch table. My teachers would be ordinary coworkers, and every sandwich, taco, salad, and homemade dessert would quietly teach me how Americans really speak. But hidden among those ordinary lunches was one Friday that would completely change my life forever. I thought I was only bringing food from home. In reality, I was carrying the first page of a story that would eventually lead me to friendship, love, marriage, children, and a completely different future than I had ever imagined. By my second month in the United States, something inside me had slowly started changing. I was still nervous. I still translated many sentences inside my head. I still missed jokes from time to time, but I was no longer hiding as much. Every lunch break became another opportunity to listen. Not perfect listening, real listening. The kind that happens when people interrupt each other, laugh before finishing a sentence, change topics without warning, and somehow still understand everything. At first, I believed fluent English meant knowing difficult words. Then I watched my coworkers speak. They used surprisingly simple vocabulary. The magic was not in the words. It was in confidence, rhythm, and connection. One afternoon, my coworker Sarah sat beside me while eating a turkey sandwich. "So, Alex," she asked with a smile, "what do you usually cook at home?" Such a simple question. Yet my brain immediately searched for perfect grammar. After a few awkward seconds, I answered slowly. "I cook many foods for my country." She smiled. "Oh, that's awesome. You should bring something someday." She did not correct my grammar. She did not look impatient. She simply continued the conversation. That was another lesson. Most conversations do not stop because of grammar mistakes. They stop because people stop trying. Psychologists often explain that language confidence grows through successful communication, not perfect communication. Every positive interaction tells the brain that speaking is safe. Over time, fear becomes smaller while confidence becomes stronger. Looking back now, I can clearly see those tiny victories building a new version of myself. Our Friday lunches became more interesting every week. One coworker always brought homemade chili from Texas. Another never arrived without fresh cookies baked by his grandmother. Someone proudly introduced authentic Mexican tamales. Another shared Korean barbecue leftovers. The conversations were never only about food. Every meal carried memories, family traditions, childhood stories, holiday celebrations. Without realizing it, I was learning much more than English. I was learning America, not the America from television. The real America. A country where dozens of cultures quietly meet around one table. One Friday, someone asked a funny question. If you had to eat only one meal forever, what would it be? The room exploded with opinions.
Pizza.
Steak. Tacos. Mac and cheese. Everyone defended their favorite food as if they were arguing in court. Finally, someone looked at me. What about you, Alex? I smiled. My favorite food would probably surprise you. Now everyone became curious. What is it? For a moment, I almost answered with something safe. Maybe fried rice. Maybe noodles. Maybe chicken. Instead, I told the truth. Balut.
Silence.
Complete silence. Several coworkers blinked. One slowly repeated the word. Balut. Another opened Google on his phone. Within seconds, facial expressions around the table became priceless. One person looked amazed. Another looked completely horrified. Someone laughed so hard that coffee almost came out of his nose. Sarah looked at me carefully. So, people actually eat this? I laughed.
Yes.
And you like it? I really do. What does it taste like? That question was much easier to answer. I described the flavor slowly, using simple English.
Rich. Warm.
Comforting. Full of memories. Suddenly the conversation changed. Nobody cared whether the food looked strange anymore. They wanted to know the story. Where did I first eat it? Who introduced it to me? Why was it special? I realized something important. Stories always make language easier to understand. Vocabulary connected to emotion stays inside the brain much longer than vocabulary learned from random lists. Educational researchers have found that storytelling activates multiple parts of the brain at the same time, improving memory, comprehension, and emotional engagement. That explains why many English learners remember stories long after forgetting grammar exercises. Every Friday after that conversation, someone jokingly asked the same question. So, when are you bringing the famous Balut? I laughed every time.
Soon.
The truth was, I was terrified, not because of the food, because sharing the food meant sharing myself. Food is personal. It carries family history, identity, childhood.
Tradition.
What if everyone rejected it? Would they reject me too? Fear has a remarkable talent. It transforms tiny possibilities into giant disasters. During the following week, I visited the same Asian grocery store again. The familiar smell reminded me of home. Families spoke languages I had not heard for weeks. Children laughed while helping their parents shop. For just a few minutes, America felt wonderfully familiar. I walked directly toward the refrigerated section. There it was again. Balut. Exactly where I remembered. I stood there much longer than necessary. Should I buy it? Should I wait? Maybe another week. Maybe another month. Maybe never. Then I remembered something my father used to tell me. If people never see who you really are, they can never truly know you. Those words echoed inside my head while I placed the package into my shopping basket. The drive home felt strangely emotional. I was not just carrying food. I was carrying courage. Thursday night arrived. I prepared everything carefully. I wanted the presentation to look clean and respectful. Not because I wanted to impress anyone. Because this food represented generations before me. My family, my memories, my culture. The next morning, I placed the container carefully inside my lunch bag. Every hour seemed longer than usual. 9 o'clock.
10.
11. My heart beat faster every time I looked at the clock. Finally, noon arrived. Coworkers slowly gathered around the large lunch table. Someone placed pizza on the counter. Someone opened homemade pasta. Someone brought fresh donuts. the room filled with laughter and familiar conversations. Then, with slightly shaking hands, I quietly placed my container onto the table. Within seconds, curious eyes turned toward me. "So," Sarah smiled. "Is today finally the day?" I took one deep breath.
Yes.
Before anyone could ask another question, I carefully opened the container. Several people leaned closer. Others stepped back. One coworker whispered, "Oh wow." Another simply stared without saying a word. Then, before I had a chance to explain anything at all, a familiar voice came from behind me. It was my boss. He looked directly at the unusual food, smiled with genuine curiosity instead of fear, folded his arms, and asked the one question that would change every relationship inside that office. "So, Alex, would you mind telling us the story behind this incredible little egg?" The day Balut stopped being weird. There is a strange truth about human nature. People are rarely afraid of food. They are afraid of the stories they invent before tasting it. That Friday afternoon, almost everyone in our office believed they already knew what Balut was because they had seen dramatic videos online or heard unbelievable stories from friends. Some expected something terrifying. Others expected a disgusting challenge. Nobody expected that a simple conversation about one unusual egg would quietly erase years of stereotypes, transform my relationship with my coworkers, and begin changing my future in America forever. Looking back now, I realize that the most powerful bridge between cultures was never perfect English. It was simple curiosity. The room became unusually quiet after my boss asked his question. "So, Alex, would you mind telling us the story behind this incredible little egg?" I smiled nervously. My hands were shaking just enough for me to notice. I looked around the table. Everyone was watching, not with judgment, with curiosity. That surprised me. For weeks I had imagined this exact moment. In every version inside my head, people laughed. Someone made a rude joke. Someone refused to stay near the table. Instead, they simply waited, waiting for my story. I took a slow breath. "This food is called Balut." I spoke carefully, one sentence at a time, exactly the way I had practiced English every evening. It is popular in several Southeast Asian countries. Many people grow up eating it. My parents introduced it to me when I was young. For me, it is not strange. It reminds me of family dinners, holidays, and conversations at home. Nobody interrupted. Even the office microwave seemed unusually quiet. My boss nodded slowly. "I like that." He wasn't talking about the food. He was talking about the memory. That single sentence changed the atmosphere immediately. Suddenly people stopped looking at the egg. They started looking at me. One coworker smiled. "So, this is comfort food?" I laughed. "Yes. Just like macaroni and cheese for some Americans." Another coworker added, "Or chicken noodle soup when you're sick."
Exactly.
The strange food had suddenly become familiar. Not because it looked different, because everyone understood the feeling behind it. Psychologists often explain that empathy grows faster through shared emotions than shared facts. When people recognize a familiar feeling inside an unfamiliar story, cultural distance begins to disappear. That afternoon, nobody needed to understand every detail of Balut. They only needed to understand what home feels like. Sarah leaned closer. "So, how do you actually eat it?" I smiled.
Slowly.
Everyone laughed. The tension was disappearing. I carefully explained each step. The shell, the broth, the seasoning, the traditions. I avoided making it sound dramatic. I simply described what millions of families had done for generations. As I spoke, something unexpected happened. Questions started coming from every direction. Who first made it? Do children eat it too? Is it expensive? Do people eat it every day? Is it sold on the street? For nearly 20 minutes, lunch stopped being lunch. It became a conversation about culture, about family, about memories, about travel,
About curiosity.
Not once did anyone call the food disgusting. Not once did anyone make me feel embarrassed. I had worried for weeks about being different. Now, everyone wanted to learn something new. Then my boss crossed his arms, smiled, and said something that made the entire room silent again.
Well,
He looked directly at me. I think it's only fair. Everyone turned toward him. If you've tried American food, maybe it's time I try yours. Someone laughed nervously. Another whispered, "Is he serious?" I wasn't sure either. I asked quietly, "You really want to try it?"
he grinned.
Absolutely. The office suddenly felt like a sports stadium before the championship game. Phones quietly appeared. Several coworkers stepped closer. Someone jokingly announced, "History is about to happen." Even I couldn't stop smiling. My boss picked up the egg carefully. He examined it from every angle. "So, this is the famous Balut." "It is." He laughed. "You know." He looked around the room. If food can survive thousands of years, it probably deserves a little respect. That sentence stayed with me. Respect. Not agreement. Not preference. Respect. There is an important difference. Nobody has to love another culture's traditions, but everyone can choose to respect them. That simple idea has the power to transform workplaces, neighborhoods, schools, and families. Researchers studying multicultural communication have repeatedly found that curiosity reduces prejudice far more effectively than argument. When people ask sincere questions instead of making quick judgments, trust develops naturally. I was watching that principle unfold right in front of me without anyone realizing it. My boss carefully cracked the shell. I quietly showed him what to do. He listened attentively. Not once did he pretend to already know. That impressed me. Real confidence often sounds like this. "Can you teach me?"
Not.
"I already know." The room became completely silent. You could almost hear people breathing. One coworker whispered dramatically, "This is either going to be amazing or unforgettable." Everyone laughed again. Even my boss. He looked at me one last time. "Ready?" I nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." He took the first bite. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. For 3 long seconds, the entire office froze. His face remained completely unreadable. One coworker covered her mouth. Another slowly shook his head as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Finally, my boss smiled. Not a polite smile. A real smile. He nodded thoughtfully. "Huh." The room exploded. "So, what does it taste like? Is it terrible? Would you eat another one?"
He laughed.
"It's actually much better than I expected." Several people gasped dramatically. "I know." He continued chewing calmly. "The flavor isn't shocking." He pointed toward me. "The story made it easier to understand." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. The story made it easier. Not the recipe. Not the appearance. The story. Isn't that true for people too? We judge strangers from the outside until we hear their stories. Then suddenly they stop being strangers. Sarah smiled at me. "I think that's true about cultures." Another coworker nodded. "And probably true about people." My boss looked around the table. "You know what I learned today?" Everyone waited. Almost every culture has food that looks strange to someone else. Heads nodded across the room. He continued. "The difference is whether we choose fear or curiosity." Nobody spoke for a few seconds. The silence felt peaceful. meaningful. For the first time since arriving in America, I no longer felt like the new employee trying to fit in. I felt like someone who had contributed something valuable. Not because my English had suddenly become perfect, not because I had impressed anyone, because I had shared a piece of home. The conversation, people began telling stories about foods from their own families. Pickled herring, Rocky Mountain oysters,
Scrapple.
lutefisk, fried alligator. Every culture had something another culture considered unusual. We laughed together. Nobody laughed at anyone. As everyone returned to work, my boss walked beside me. He smiled and quietly said something that completely caught me off guard. "You know, Alex, my wife would absolutely love meeting someone who tells stories the way you do. We're having a small barbecue at our house next weekend. Why don't you come?" I had no idea that accepting that simple invitation would introduce me to one person who would completely change the rest of my life. My boss took another bite, then said something nobody expected. Everyone thought the biggest surprise of that Friday lunch had already happened. My American boss had actually tasted Balut, smiled, and admitted that it was much better than he expected. Foam slowly disappeared. People returned to eating their own lunches. The excitement seemed to be over. But then my boss reached for the Balut a second time. The room instantly became silent again. Why would someone voluntarily eat another bite of a food that millions of people online call one of the world's strangest dishes? None of us knew that his next sentence would completely change how I viewed America, my coworkers, my English journey, and even the direction of my personal life. Sometimes people remember a meal because of the food. I remember this one because of 5 minutes that quietly changed everything. My boss picked up the spoon again. Nobody said a word. Several coworkers exchanged surprised looks. Sarah laughed softly. "Wait, you're actually going back for another bite?" He smiled. "Why not? You aren't scared anymore?" He shook his head. "I wasn't really scared before." He paused for a moment. "I was simply curious." That answer stayed in my mind long after lunch ended.
Curiosity.
Such a simple word. Yet it has the power to open doors that fear keeps permanently locked. He slowly finished another bite before placing the spoon on the table. I think people make a mistake. Everyone looked at him. They judge food before hearing the story. He turned toward me. "Today I almost judged your culture before understanding it." His honesty surprised me. Successful leaders rarely become respected because they know everything. More often, they earn respect because they are willing to admit when they are wrong. Watching my boss speak so openly taught me something that no English textbook had ever explained. Confidence is not pretending to have all the answers. Confidence is staying curious when you don't. One coworker laughed. "So, would you order Balut at a restaurant now?" The entire table laughed. My boss smiled. "Maybe." The room exploded again. Then he added another sentence. "Would I eat it every week? Probably not." More laughter. "But if someone invites me into their culture through food, I'd happily say yes." Nobody expected lunch to become philosophical. Yet somehow it did. The conversation slowly shifted away from the egg itself. Instead, people began sharing stories about moments when they had misunderstood another culture. One coworker admitted she had been nervous eating sushi for the first time. Another confessed he once thought maple syrup belonged only on pancakes until visiting Canada. Someone else laughed while describing her first experience with spicy Korean food. Every story ended exactly the same way. Fear disappeared after experience. Psychologists often describe this phenomenon as reducing uncertainty through direct exposure. The human brain naturally fears unfamiliar experiences because unfamiliar situations feel unpredictable. However, Positive first-hand experiences quickly replace imagined fears with real memories. That afternoon, I watched dozens of assumptions quietly disappear around one lunch table. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of asking more questions about Balut, people started asking questions about me.
What was your hometown like?
What holidays do you celebrate? What foods do you miss most? What brought you to America? Those questions felt completely different. They weren't polite conversation anymore. They were genuine interest. For the first time since arriving in the United States, I wasn't simply answering English questions. I was telling my own story.
Slowly. Clearly.
Without worrying about making every sentence perfect. And strangely enough, nobody cared about my mistakes. They cared about my meaning. Language experts often explain that communication depends far more on shared understanding than grammatical perfection. Native speakers naturally overlook small mistakes when the message remains clear. I finally experienced that truth instead of simply reading about it. As lunch continued, my boss quietly sat beside me. "You know something, Alex?" "What's that?" "I've been managing people for almost 20 years. Authentic. That word echoed inside my mind. For weeks I had been trying to sound like everyone else. Trying to hide my accent. Trying not to stand out. Trying to become invisible. Ironically, people only began remembering me after I stopped hiding who I was. There is an important lesson inside that. People rarely connect through perfection. They connect through honesty. A few minutes later, everyone slowly stood up to return to work. Coffee cups were collected. Lunch boxes disappeared. Conversations became quieter. As I picked up my container, my boss gently stopped me. "Alex." "Yes." He looked completely serious now. "I want to thank you." I blinked. "For what?" "For trusting us." I looked confused. He continued, "You didn't just bring lunch today. You brought part of your life." Nobody had ever described it that way before. Maybe he was right. Food had only been the beginning. Trust was the real gift. As we walked back toward our offices, he suddenly asked another question. "What are you doing next Saturday?" I thought for a moment. "Nothing special." He smiled. "My wife and I are hosting our annual backyard barbecue." I nodded politely. "It'll be fun." Then he added something unexpected. "I'd really like you to come." I almost answered immediately. Then doubt returned. Would I fit in? Would everyone already know each other? Would my English be good enough? Fear has remarkable timing. It often arrives exactly when opportunity knocks. My boss must have noticed my hesitation. He smiled kindly. "Relax. You already survived feeding me Balut." I laughed. "I guess that's true. If I can survive that." He grinned. "You can survive one barbecue." That joke somehow erased half my anxiety. Research on social confidence shows that humor lowers psychological stress while increasing feelings of belonging. Shared laughter signals safety to the brain, making future conversations feel less threatening. Looking back, that simple joke probably helped me accept the invitation more than any logical argument could have. Before entering his office, my boss turned around one last time. "Oh, and one more thing." "Yes?" "My wife loves meeting people from different cultures." He smiled knowingly. "I have a feeling you'll enjoy talking with her." At the time, those words sounded completely ordinary. I had no reason to think twice about them. A barbecue was just a barbecue. Or so I believed. Saturday finally arrived. The weather was warm. The sky was perfectly blue. American flags moved gently in the summer breeze. Children laughed somewhere down the street. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs. Holding a small homemade dessert in my hands as a thank you gift, I stood in front of my boss's house, took one deep breath, and rang the doorbell. The door slowly opened. My boss welcomed me with a wide smile. Behind him stood several guests, talking happily in the backyard. Then, across the garden, I noticed a woman laughing while helping a little girl carry a tray of lemonade. For one brief second, our eyes met. She smiled. I smiled back. Neither of us could possibly imagine that one strange egg, one courageous lunch, and one unexpected invitation had quietly brought the two of us to the exact moment where an entirely new love story was about to begin. The backyard barbecue that changed my life. If someone had told me that the biggest breakthrough in my English journey would begin beside a smoking barbecue grill instead of inside a classroom, I would have laughed. If someone had told me that the strange lunch where my American boss ate Balut would lead me to meet the woman who would one day become my wife, I would never have believed it. Yet life has a funny habit of hiding extraordinary moments inside completely ordinary weekends. That Saturday looked like nothing special on the calendar, but by sunset I would understand something that millions of English learners never hear. Language grows fastest when your heart is busy living instead of worrying. And before that beautiful afternoon ended, one simple conversation about food would quietly become the bridge between two families, two cultures, and two completely different futures. I stood outside my boss's house holding a small homemade dessert with slightly nervous hands. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. Someone nearby was mowing the lawn. The smell of grilled burgers floated through the warm summer air. American flags moved gently in the breeze. Everything looked exactly like the suburban neighborhoods I had only seen in movies. My boss opened the front door with a huge smile. "Alex, I'm so glad you came. Thank you for inviting me."
He laughed. "Come on."
Everyone's already in the backyard. As we walked through the house, I could already hear laughter. Real laughter. Not the polite, kind people use at work. Family laughter. Friends laughing without thinking about tomorrow's meetings. The backyard was full of life. Children chased each other across the grass. Neighbors stood around the grill talking about baseball, travel, and summer vacations. Someone played soft country music from a portable speaker. Another guest carefully turned hamburgers over glowing charcoal. Everything felt relaxed. Nobody seemed to be trying to impress anyone. That immediately made me feel more comfortable. Then my boss introduced me to his wife. "This is Emily." She smiled warmly and shook my hand. "So you're the famous Balut guy." I laughed. "I guess I am." "My husband couldn't stop talking about your story." Her kindness instantly made me forget half my nervousness. Within minutes, she introduced me to several guests. Nobody asked difficult questions. Nobody expected perfect English.
They simply welcomed me.
That surprised me again. For weeks I had imagined social gatherings as impossible language tests. Instead, they felt like conversations where everyone wanted each other to succeed. Researchers studying language acquisition often explain that relaxed environments improve comprehension and speaking ability because stress hormones decrease while memory and attention improve. In other words, people often speak better English when they stop trying to sound perfect. That afternoon became living proof of that idea. As conversations flowed naturally, I noticed someone arranging bowls of fruit and drinks near the picnic table. She was the same woman I had noticed when I first walked into the backyard. She laughed while helping a little girl pour lemonade into paper cups. There was something calm about her. Nothing dramatic. Nothing exaggerated. Just a quiet confidence that made people naturally smile around her. A few minutes later, Emily waved toward her. "Rachel, come over here." She looked up. "I want you to meet Alex." Rachel walked toward us with an easy smile.
"Hi. I'm Rachel." I'm Alex.
For 2 seconds we simply smiled. Not because we had nothing to say, because we were both slightly shy. Emily quietly disappeared with a knowing smile that I completely failed to understand. Rachel broke the silence first. So, she laughed softly. Did my husband really eat Balut? I couldn't help laughing. He actually ate 2 bites. Her eyes became wide. You're kidding. I wish I were. She covered her mouth while laughing. The conversation suddenly became effortless. We talked about travel,
Books.
music, favorite restaurants, national parks, weekend hobbies. The amazing part wasn't that my English had suddenly become perfect. The amazing part was that I had stopped thinking about English. I was simply talking. Language experts often call this communicative flow. Once attention shifts from grammar toward meaningful interaction, speech becomes more natural because the brain focuses on ideas rather than individual words. Looking back now, I think that afternoon was the first time I truly experienced English instead of translating it. Rachel asked an unexpected question. So, what do you miss most about home? I thought carefully. My family. She nodded. I understand. My parents live across the country. It's different, she continued. But sometimes distance still feels lonely. That answer surprised me. Loneliness sounds similar in every language. For the next hour, we walked slowly around the backyard while everyone else continued talking nearby. She asked thoughtful questions. Not because she wanted exciting answers, because she genuinely wanted to understand. I told her about traditional family dinners, holiday celebrations, street markets, childhood memories. She listened carefully without interrupting. Then she shared stories from her own childhood, camping trips, Christmas mornings, learning recipes from her grandmother, summer evenings around family barbecues. Although our childhoods happened thousands of miles apart, many feelings were exactly the same. Love, family,
Tradition. Hope.
home. That realization felt strangely comforting. Different cultures often tell similar stories using different foods, different holidays, and different languages. As the afternoon continued, someone jokingly shouted across the yard, "Hey, Alex, when are you cooking for all of us?" Everyone laughed. Before I could answer, Rachel smiled mischievously. I think that's an excellent idea. I laughed. Only if someone teaches me how to make authentic American barbecue. My boss immediately raised his hand.
Deal.
Several neighbors applauded dramatically. One joked, "International Food Exchange Program approved." Laughter filled the backyard once again. Psychologists studying intercultural friendships have found that shared activities like cooking together create stronger trust than formal conversations alone. Preparing food requires cooperation, communication, and storytelling, making it one of the easiest ways for people from different backgrounds to build meaningful relationships. As sunset slowly painted the sky orange, guests began saying goodbye. Children climbed sleepily into family cars. Paper plates disappeared. The grill finally cooled. I thanked my boss and Emily for inviting me. Before leaving, Rachel walked with me toward the driveway. I had a really nice time. So did I. She hesitated for just a second. Would you maybe like to get coffee sometime? For a brief moment, I wondered if I had misunderstood her English. Then she smiled again. I promise I speak slowly. I laughed. I'd like that. She handed me a small piece of paper with her phone number. As I drove home that evening, I realized something almost unbelievable. Just a week earlier, I had been afraid to bring Balut to work because I thought people would judge me. Now my boss had become a trusted friend. My coworkers felt like family. And a woman with a warm smile and endless curiosity had just asked me to meet her again. Sometimes people believe learning English changes only their vocabulary. They are wrong. Learning English changes your opportunities, your friendships, your confidence, and occasionally, without warning, it changes your entire future. But neither Rachel nor I could possibly imagine that our first coffee together would soon become the beginning of a love story that would be tested by cultural differences, family expectations, marriage, children, and one unforgettable dinner where Balut would once again surprise everyone. Our first coffee turned into forever. People love to say that love begins with fireworks, dramatic moments, or perfect timing. My story was nothing like that. There were no movie scenes, no romantic music playing in the background, and certainly no perfect English. Our story began because two people kept asking simple questions and actually listened to the answers. Looking back now, I sometimes laugh at how close I came to saying no when Rachel invited me for coffee. If fear had won that day, I would have missed not only the love of my life, but also the family we would build together. The children who would one day laugh at both of our accents while learning two cultures. And a lesson far more valuable than any grammar book could ever teach. Sometimes the most important English conversation of your life starts with two ordinary words. Hi again. The following Saturday arrived much faster than I expected. I checked my phone at least 20 times before leaving home. Should I wear a casual shirt? Would a jacket look too formal? Would I understand everything she said? Would long moments of silence become awkward? My brain invented hundreds of imaginary problems before breakfast. Fear has an incredible imagination. Reality is usually much kinder. We agreed to meet at a small neighborhood coffee shop. Nothing expensive. Nothing fancy. Just a quiet place where people read books, worked on laptops, and enjoyed slow Saturday mornings. When I arrived, Rachel was already there. She smiled as soon as she saw me. You made it. I almost got lost. She laughed. Good. I looked confused. Why is that good? Because now I don't feel bad for being 5 minutes late. Within seconds, we were both laughing. The nervousness quietly disappeared. That became one of the first things I noticed about Rachel. She never tried to impress people. She simply made them feel comfortable. Researchers who study healthy relationships often explain that emotional safety is one of the strongest predictors of long-term connection. People naturally communicate more openly when they feel accepted instead of evaluated. Without realizing it, Rachel created exactly that kind of space from our very first conversation. We ordered coffee and found a table near the window. Outside, families walked their dogs. Children rode scooters along the sidewalk. The entire morning felt peaceful. So, Rachel asked while stirring her coffee, what is the hardest part about moving to America? I expected a simple conversation. Instead, she asked a question that reached much deeper. I thought quietly before answering. I thought English would be the hardest part. And I was wrong. She tilted her head. What was harder? Feeling invisible. She didn't interrupt. She didn't immediately respond. She simply listened. Many people underestimate the power of listening. Sometimes silence is more generous than advice. I explained how difficult my first months had been, smiling when I didn't understand jokes, practicing conversations alone at home, feeling exhausted after speaking English all day, wondering if I truly belonged. Rachel nodded slowly. I've never moved to another country. She smiled gently. But I know what loneliness feels like. That answer surprised me. I realized something important. Pain does not have to look identical for people to understand each other. Different experiences often create similar emotions. For the next 2 hours, conversation flowed naturally. We talked about childhood dreams, favorite books, travel destinations, music, family traditions. We laughed about cultural misunderstandings. I told her how confused I had been when strangers constantly asked, "How's it going?" I thought everyone wanted a detailed answer. She laughed so hard that people at the next table smiled.
So what did you say?
I explained my entire day. She laughed even harder. Oh no. It took me weeks to realize they were usually just saying hello. She wiped tears from laughing. I wish I could have seen that. Then she shared one of her own embarrassing moments. She had traveled abroad during college and accidentally offended an elderly woman because she misunderstood a local custom. I felt terrible. She smiled. But that mistake taught me something. What's that? Curiosity is much more important than pretending. That sentence instantly reminded me of my boss.
Curiosity.
It seemed to appear everywhere. First at work, then during lunch, now here. Maybe curiosity was quietly connecting every important moment of my new life. Educational psychologists often describe curiosity as one of the strongest drivers of lifelong learning. Curious people ask more questions, remember information more effectively, and adapt more easily to unfamiliar environments. Looking back, curiosity had become the invisible bridge connecting language learning, friendship, and now love. As weeks passed, our coffee meetings became regular. Sometimes we visited museums. Sometimes we walked through city parks. Sometimes we simply sat on a bench watching people pass by while practicing conversation. Rachel never corrected every grammar mistake. Instead, she naturally repeated my sentences correctly during conversation. If I accidentally said, "Yesterday I go shopping," she would answer, "Oh, you went shopping yesterday? What did you buy?" Without making me feel embarrassed, she helped me hear natural English again and again. Language teachers call this gentle recasting. Instead of directly correcting mistakes, fluent speakers naturally model the correct form during conversation. Research shows this approach often improves confidence while helping learners absorb grammar naturally. Little by little, my English improved. More importantly, my confidence improved. One evening we cooked dinner together at my apartment. I introduced her to several dishes from my childhood. She carefully watched every step. "You measure everything by feeling?" I laughed. "My grandmother never used measuring cups." Rachel smiled. "That's either amazing or terrifying." When dinner was ready, she tasted the first bite. Her eyes widened. "This is incredible." I smiled. "Are you just being polite?"
No.
She pointed toward the plate. "I'm asking for the recipe." We both laughed. A few days later, she invited me to cook with her parents. Her father proudly taught me how to prepare classic American barbecue. Her mother shared an old family recipe for homemade apple pie. Suddenly, our weekends became something beautiful. One weekend we explored my culture. The next weekend I explored hers. Nobody tried to replace one tradition with another. We simply added new traditions together. Relationship experts often explain that successful intercultural couples thrive not by choosing one culture over another, but by creating a shared culture that honors both backgrounds. At the time, we weren't thinking about psychology. We were simply enjoying each other's worlds. Months passed almost without notice. One crisp autumn afternoon, Rachel and I returned to the same coffee shop where everything had begun. The leaves outside had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. We smiled as we remembered our awkward first meeting. "I was so nervous," I admitted. "I know. You knew." She laughed. "You stirred your coffee for almost 10 minutes without drinking it." I couldn't stop laughing. "You noticed?" I noticed everything. Then her smile became softer. "I'm really glad you came that day. I almost canceled. She looked surprised.
Really?
I was afraid my English wasn't good enough. She reached across the table and gently held my hand. I never fell in love with your grammar. For a moment, the entire coffee shop seemed to disappear. I fell in love with your kindness, my curiosity, your courage, and the way your eyes light up every time you talk about your family. My heart felt completely still. I smiled. There is something I've wanted to ask you. She looked at me quietly. I reached into my jacket pocket, not for grammar notes, not for vocabulary cards, but for a small ring that had been waiting there all afternoon. And just before I spoke the most important English sentence of my entire life, I realized that none of this would have happened if one curious American boss had never looked at a strange little egg and said, "I'll try it." We didn't choose one culture, we chose both. Many people believe that the hardest part of an international love story is the proposal. They imagine the nervous hands, the racing heartbeat, and the unforgettable question. They are wrong. The proposal lasted only a few seconds. Building a life together lasted every single day afterward. The real challenge began when two families, two traditions, two kitchens, two holiday calendars, two languages, and two completely different childhoods slowly came together under one roof. Some people quietly warned us that one of us would eventually have to give up our culture to make the marriage work. What happened instead surprised everyone around us. We discovered that love does not ask people to become the same. It asks them to become curious enough to grow together. And one unforgettable family dinner, where Balut appeared once again, proved that the strongest families are not built on perfect agreement but on joyful understanding. Rachel said yes. For a few beautiful seconds, the entire coffee shop disappeared. I could not hear the quiet music. I could not hear people ordering drinks. All I could hear was her voice. Yes. One simple word. One unforgettable moment. One new beginning. When we shared the news with our families, the reactions were filled with excitement. My parents were overjoyed. Rachel's parents welcomed me like another son. Friends celebrated with us. Coworkers filled the office with congratulations. Even my boss smiled proudly. I knew that barbecue invitation was a good idea. Everyone laughed. A few months later, we stood together during a small wedding ceremony surrounded by family and close friends. Nothing extravagant. Nothing dramatic. Just two people promising to keep learning from each other for the rest of their lives. That promise became much bigger than either of us realized. Marriage, I quickly learned, is not only about love. It is about daily conversations, tiny decisions, shared habits, respect, patience, and countless opportunities to ask one important question. Can you help me understand? Relationship researchers often explain that successful marriages depend less on avoiding differences and more on responding to those differences with curiosity instead of criticism. Couples who ask questions before making assumptions tend to build stronger trust over time. Rachel and I did not know the research back then. We simply kept asking questions. Our first holiday season together was full of small surprises. Christmas looked different from anything I had experienced growing up. Rachel's family decorated the house weeks before December. The Christmas tree became the center of the living room. Everyone exchanged handmade ornaments filled with memories. Children eagerly counted the days until Christmas morning. I loved every moment. When my family celebrated our traditional holidays, Rachel joined with exactly the same enthusiasm. She helped prepare special dishes. She learned traditional greetings. She even practiced difficult words from my language. Sometimes she pronounced them perfectly. Sometimes we laughed until tears filled our eyes. Every mistake became another family memory. One evening, while organizing our kitchen after dinner, Rachel smiled at me. I have an idea. What is it? Instead of choosing your traditions or mine. She paused dramatically. Why don't we keep both? Such a simple sentence. Yet it quietly shaped the rest of our marriage. From that day forward, our home slowly became something entirely new. American recipes sat beside family recipes from my childhood. Thanksgiving appeared beside celebrations from my homeland. Apple pie shared space with traditional desserts from my culture. Christmas ornaments hung beside handmade decorations my mother had mailed across the ocean. Nothing competed. Everything belonged. Psychologists studying multicultural families often describe this approach as cultural integration rather than cultural replacement. Children raised in homes that celebrate multiple traditions frequently develop stronger adaptability, broader cultural understanding, and greater empathy toward others. Long before we became parents, our home was already growing into that kind of place. Then came the dinner everyone still talks about. Rachel suggested inviting both families together for the first time. I immediately became nervous. What if they don't connect? She smiled. They already have something in common. What? They both love us. I had never thought about it that way. The evening finally arrived. Rachel's parents prepared homemade barbecue. My mother proudly cooked several traditional dishes. My father carefully arranged everything on the dining table. Conversations began cautiously. Everyone smiled politely. Nobody wanted to make a mistake. Then Rachel suddenly disappeared into the kitchen. She returned carrying one familiar plate. Balut. I looked at her with complete surprise. You found it. She smiled proudly. I wanted tonight to remind everyone how all of this started. The room instantly filled with laughter. My boss, who had also been invited, recognized it immediately. Oh no. Everyone turned toward him. He laughed loudly. Don't worry. I've survived this before. Rachel's father smiled mischievously. So, you've actually eaten that? I have. And, he grinned. I even had seconds. The entire table burst into laughter. Suddenly, every trace of awkwardness disappeared. People stopped worrying about saying the perfect thing. Instead, they started sharing stories. Funny stories. Childhood stories. Embarrassing cooking disasters. Favorite holiday memories. Researchers who study family communication have found that shared storytelling strengthens emotional connection far more effectively than formal conversation. Stories invite vulnerability, laughter, and empathy, all essential ingredients for lasting relationships. As dinner continued, Rachel quietly reached for my hand beneath the table. She whispered softly, "See, what? They're already becoming one family." She was right. My mother exchanged recipes with Rachel's mother. Our fathers debated barbecue techniques like lifelong friends. Children played together in the backyard without caring which traditions belonged to which country. At one point, my boss stood and raised his glass. I'd like to make a toast. Everyone became quiet. I've spent years working with people from different backgrounds. He looked around the table. Tonight reminded me that cultures don't become stronger by staying apart. He smiled warmly. They become stronger by sharing a meal. The room answered with quiet applause. I looked around the table. Just months earlier, I had been terrified to bring one unusual egg to the office. Now that same food had become a symbol of friendship, family, trust, love. Life has an incredible sense of humor. Sometimes it hides miracles inside ordinary lunches. Months turned into years. Rachel and I settled into everyday married life. Morning coffee together. Weekend grocery shopping. Family movie nights. Long evening walks. Life was wonderfully ordinary. Then one rainy afternoon, Rachel walked into the living room holding something very small. "I have news." My heart immediately raced. "What happened?" She smiled through happy tears. "We're going to need a bigger dining table." I looked at her, completely confused. Then she gently placed a tiny pair of baby shoes into my hands. At that moment, I realized our greatest adventure was no longer about two people learning two cultures. It was about raising a child who would one day call both cultures home. Our children grew up speaking two hearts. People often ask us one question with a worried expression. Won't your children become confused if they grow up with two cultures and two languages? Every time I hear that question, I smile because I once worried about exactly the same thing. I imagined our future children struggling to understand where they belonged. I wondered whether they would feel more American or more connected to my homeland. I even worried they might reject one side of their family. But life surprised us once again. Our children never saw two cultures competing. They saw two families loving them. They never thought of two languages as a burden. They thought of them as two different ways to say, "I love you." Looking back now, I realize the greatest English lesson I ever learned did not happen at work or during a conversation with my boss. It happened while reading bedtime stories to my children, slowly, one page at a time, discovering that language is not only something we speak. It is something we share. The day our first child was born remains one of the happiest memories of my life. As I held our tiny daughter for the first time, everything else disappeared. The busy office, the stressful meetings, the nervous English conversations from years earlier. None of them mattered anymore. Rachel smiled at me from the hospital bed. "What are you thinking?" I looked at our daughter sleeping peacefully. "I'm wondering which language she'll say first." Rachel laughed softly. I was wondering the same thing. That conversation became the beginning of one of the most beautiful adventures of our marriage. From the very beginning, we made a simple decision. No pressure. No complicated rules. Just consistency. I would naturally speak my first language with our daughter. Rachel would naturally speak English. Not because one language was better. Because both languages represented love. Researchers studying bilingual children have consistently found that young children are remarkably capable of learning two languages simultaneously. When each language is used consistently in meaningful daily interactions. Contrary to popular myths, bilingualism does not confuse healthy children. Instead, it often strengthens cognitive flexibility, problem-solving skills, and cultural awareness throughout life. Of course, real life was rarely as organized as research papers. Some mornings our daughter mixed both languages into one hilarious sentence. She would begin speaking English, suddenly switch to my language, then invent a completely new word that belonged to neither. Rachel and I looked at each other. What exactly did she just say? Neither of us knew. Our daughter laughed proudly, as if she had invented the world's greatest language. Maybe she had, the language of childhood. One evening during dinner, she looked at me seriously.
Daddy.
Yes. Can Grandma understand Mommy? I smiled. Sometimes. Can Mommy understand Grandma? Sometimes. She thought carefully before asking another question. So, who translates for hugs? Rachel and I both laughed. Children have an amazing way of asking questions that adults never imagine. I gently answered. Hugs never need translation. She nodded as if that made perfect sense. Then she climbed into her grandmother's lap without saying another word. Sometimes children understand life more clearly than adults. As the years passed, bedtime became my favorite part of every day. Every evening, our daughter chose two books. One English story. One story from my childhood. We sat together quietly. I read slowly,
Clearly.
one sentence at a time. Without realizing it, those bedtime stories became the greatest English lessons of my life. Not because I was practicing pronunciation, because I was practicing connection. Educational psychologists explain that reading aloud strengthens vocabulary, listening comprehension, pronunciation, emotional bonding, and long-term literacy skills simultaneously. Children remember language far more effectively when words are connected to warmth, safety, and shared attention. Looking back, I think I improved my English almost as much as my daughter did. A few years later, our son arrived. Now our home became even louder. Tiny footsteps filled every hallway. Laughter echoed through every room. Toy dinosaurs somehow appeared in impossible places. Our kitchen became a place where two cultures quietly met every single day. Saturday mornings often began with pancakes covered in maple syrup. Sunday afternoons might include recipes from my childhood. Holiday seasons became wonderfully creative. Christmas cookies shared the same table with traditional family desserts. Thanksgiving turkey stood beside dishes that reminded me of home. Friends sometimes asked our children an interesting question. So, which food do you like better? Our daughter usually smiled confidently. Both. What about holidays? Both. What about languages? She laughed. Both. Children rarely see reasons to choose when adults stop forcing them to. One afternoon, my boss visited our house with his family.
Yes.
The same boss. The one who had once bravely tasted Balut. He had become almost like an uncle to our children. Our daughter ran toward him happily. Guess what? What? I'm learning another language at school too. He smiled proudly. That's amazing. She looked at him very seriously. Daddy says every language teaches a new way to see the world.
He looked over at me.
I like that. Then he laughed. I still remember the day your dad completely changed lunch at the office. Our children immediately became curious. What happened? Rachel smiled mischievously. Oh, that's one of our favorite family stories. The children gathered around the table. Even though they had heard it before, they wanted to hear it again. I described the famous Friday lunch, the nervous feeling, the strange egg, the curious coworkers, my brave boss taking his first bite. Our children laughed louder every time they reached the funny parts. When I finished, my son asked the question everyone at the table had secretly expected. Dad. Yes. Do you still eat Balut? I smiled. Sometimes. He looked thoughtful. Can I try it someday? Rachel looked at me and smiled. I guess history repeats itself. Everyone burst into laughter. Psychologists often explain that children develop openness toward diversity primarily by observing trusted adults. When parents respond to unfamiliar cultures with curiosity instead of fear, children naturally adopt the same mindset. Watching my own children ask curious questions instead of making quick judgments reminded me of the lesson my boss had unknowingly taught me years earlier. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Rachel and I quietly cleaned the kitchen together. The children were already asleep upstairs. She leaned against the counter and smiled. Do you ever think about that Friday lunch? I laughed softly. Almost every week. Me too. She shook her head in amazement. One egg. One conversation. One invitation. And now. She looked toward the staircase where our children were sleeping peacefully. We have this. I followed her eyes. A warm home. 2 happy children. 2 cultures living side by side. 2 languages spoken with love. And a future we could never have imagined on the day I almost decided not to bring Balut to work. At that moment, I realized that our children were not simply growing up bilingual. They were growing up believing that curiosity is stronger than fear. Kindness travels across every language. And sometimes the smallest act of courage can quietly change generations. But the greatest lesson of my journey was still waiting to be shared, because one question from a young English learner would soon make me look back at my entire life and finally understand what had truly transformed me from the inside out. One student asked me a question I could never forget. Years after I first arrived in America, after my boss bravely tasted Balut, after I fell in love with Rachel, after we built a home filled with 2 cultures and 2 languages, I believed I finally understood my own journey. I thought the biggest lesson had already happened. Then one quiet evening, after I finished sharing my story with a small group of English learners, a young student slowly raised a hand and asked a question so simple that it completely stopped me. When did you finally become fluent? I smiled at first because I expected an easy answer. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I could not answer with a date, a vocabulary score, or a grammar level. The real answer had nothing to do with perfect English. In fact, the moment my life truly changed happened long before I considered myself fluent. That question forced me to look backward through every conversation, every mistake, every friendship, every family dinner, and every unexpected moment that quietly transformed not only the way I spoke, but also the way I lived. The question stayed in my mind for several days. When did you become fluent? At first, I almost answered the way many people do. When I stopped making grammar mistakes. But that wasn't true. Even today, I occasionally make small mistakes. Sometimes I choose the wrong word. Sometimes I speak too quickly. Sometimes I still ask people to repeat themselves. Language never becomes completely finished. It keeps growing. Then I considered another answer. Maybe I became fluent after working in America for several years. That wasn't true either. There were people at work whose English was technically better than mine, yet they still felt nervous speaking. Confidence and fluency were clearly not identical. The more I reflected on my journey, the more one memory kept returning. That Friday lunch, the day I carried Balut into the office. Not because my English suddenly improved that afternoon, because something much more important changed. I stopped hiding. Psychologists often describe authenticity as one of the strongest foundations of lasting confidence. When people constantly try to hide parts of themselves, mental energy becomes divided between communication and self-protection. But when people feel accepted as they truly are, communication becomes more natural because the brain no longer wastes energy pretending. Looking back now, bringing Balut to work was never really about food. It was about permission. Permission to be myself. A few months after answering questions from that English class, I volunteered to help new international employees joining our company. Every year, I recognized the same expression on their faces. The careful smile, the quiet hesitation, the invisible fear. It looked exactly like the face I saw in my own mirror years earlier. One young engineer approached me after orientation. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What if my English isn't good enough?" I smiled because I had once asked myself the exact same question. Instead of giving a long speech, I asked him something different. "What do you enjoy talking about?" He looked surprised. "My grandmother." "Soccer." "My hometown." "My dog." I nodded. "Good. Start there." He looked confused. "Really?"
Yes.
If people know what you care about, they'll usually stop noticing your mistakes. Researchers studying second language communication have consistently found that emotionally meaningful conversations improve language retention more effectively than memorizing isolated vocabulary. Stories activate memory, emotion, and attention simultaneously, making language easier to understand and remember. That explained why I remembered conversations about family far more clearly than hundreds of grammar exercises. Over time, I noticed something fascinating. The employees who improved fastest were not always the ones with the biggest vocabulary. They were the ones who stayed curious. They asked questions. They laughed at mistakes. They accepted corrections without embarrassment. Most importantly, they kept speaking. One afternoon, I organized a small international lunch at the office. It reminded me of the famous lunch years earlier. This time, however, I wasn't the nervous newcomer. I was the person welcoming others. Tables quickly filled with dishes from around the world. Indian curry, Japanese sushi, Brazilian cheese bread, Italian lasagna, Mexican tamales, Vietnamese spring rolls, Middle Eastern hummus, Polish pierogi. The room looked beautifully familiar. One new employee stood quietly near the wall holding a homemade dish. I recognized that expression immediately. She was debating whether to share it. I walked over with a smile. Looks delicious. She laughed nervously. I don't think everyone will agree. I know exactly how that feels. Her eyes widened. You do? I smiled.
Trust me.
I once introduced my office to Balut. She stared for 2 seconds, then burst into laughter. No way. Oh yes. And my boss ate 2 bites. She laughed even harder. I don't believe you. My wife still tells the story. That simple conversation relaxed her immediately. A few minutes later, she proudly shared her family recipe with everyone, just as I had years before. Watching that moment unfold felt strangely emotional. Life had quietly come full circle. Educational research often highlights the importance of role models in language development. Seeing someone with a similar background succeed makes difficult goals feel achievable. Without realizing it, I had become the kind of person I desperately needed when I first arrived in America. That evening, I returned home carrying leftovers from the office lunch. Rachel greeted me at the door. How was your day? I smiled. It reminded me of us. She laughed. That usually means food was involved. It definitely was. During dinner, I told her everything. The nervous employee, the shared stories, the laughter, the cultural exchange. She listened quietly before asking one thoughtful question. So, what did you tell them? I thought for a moment. I told them something I wish someone had told me years ago. What? You don't have to sound American to belong in America. She smiled warmly. I like that. Our daughter, now old enough to understand much more than we realized, looked up from her plate. Dad? Yes? Does belonging mean everyone is the same? I shook my head gently.
No.
Belonging means people make room for each other. She smiled as if the answer were perfectly obvious. Children often understand complicated truths with remarkable simplicity. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, I opened an old notebook from my first months in the United States. Inside were dozens of simple English phrases. Can you repeat that? Could you speak a little slower? Nice to meet you. Thank you. I smiled while turning each page. Those tiny sentences had once felt enormous. Now they felt like old friends. Then a folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages. It was the small note Rachel had given me after our first barbecue. Her phone number was still written in blue ink. I laughed quietly. One tiny piece of paper. One curious boss. One unusual lunch. One brave conversation. Sometimes people spend years searching for the secret to learning English. I think the secret has always been much simpler. Learn words.
Yes.
Practice every day. Absolutely. But never forget to live while you're learning. Because the conversations that change your life are rarely the ones you rehearse. They are the ones you almost never have because fear nearly convinces you to stay silent. And as I closed that old notebook, I realized there was only one final chapter left to tell, the lesson my entire journey had been quietly teaching from the very beginning. A lesson far bigger than Balut, bigger than language, and even bigger than my own story. The smallest courage changed everything. If I could sit beside the frightened version of myself from years ago, the man who stood outside his office holding a container of Balut while wondering whether everyone would laugh, I would not give him a longer vocabulary list. I would not hand him another grammar book. I would simply tell him one sentence. Walk through that door. Because life almost never changes through giant, dramatic moments. It changes through tiny acts of courage that seem completely ordinary at the time. One lunch, one conversation, one question, one smile, one invitation. Looking backward, those moments look like destiny. Living through them, they felt almost too small to matter. That is the greatest illusion fear ever creates. It convinces us that small brave actions cannot possibly change a life. Mine proves exactly the opposite. Several months after I found Rachel's old note inside my notebook, I was invited to speak at a community event for new immigrants and English learners. The room looked familiar, not because I had visited before, because I recognized the expressions.
Hope. Excitement.
Uncertainty. Quiet fear. Every face reminded me of my first weeks in America. Some people held notebooks tightly. Others whispered nervous English sentences before the event started. One young woman repeatedly practiced introducing herself. An older man quietly reviewed simple vocabulary cards. A teenage student stared at the floor as if hoping nobody would ask him to speak. I understood every one of those feelings. Because years earlier, they had all belonged to me. When I walked onto the small stage, I did not begin with grammar. I did not begin with pronunciation. Instead, I smiled and asked one simple question. Has anyone here ever stayed silent because you were afraid your English wasn't good enough? Almost every hand slowly rose. Some people laughed nervously. Others simply nodded. I smiled. So did I. The room immediately relaxed. There is something powerful about realizing you're not struggling alone. Psychologists describe this as normalization. When people discover that their fears are shared by others, anxiety often decreases because the brain stops interpreting those feelings as personal failure. Instead, they become part of a common human experience. I began telling my story. The first difficult months, the lonely evenings, the endless translating inside my head, the exhausting effort to sound perfect. People listened carefully. Some smiled. Others quietly wiped away tears. Then I reached the part everyone was waiting for. The strangest thing I ever brought to work. Several people laughed. Was Balut. The room instantly became curious. I described the nervous walk into the office. The silent lunch table. My coworkers staring at the unusual food. My boss asking about the story behind it. The first brave bite. The second bite. The invitation to the backyard barbecue. Meeting Rachel. Building a family. Raising bilingual children. Every chapter connected to one ordinary decision. Sharing lunch. When I finished, the room remained completely quiet. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Finally, an elderly gentleman slowly raised his hand. I thought this was going to be a story about food. I smiled. So did I. Everyone laughed softly. But it became a story about courage. He nodded. I think it became a story about belonging. That answer stayed with me. Belonging. For years I believed belonging meant becoming more like everyone else. Now I understood something completely different. Belonging grows when people make room for each other's differences, not when those differences disappear. Researchers studying community integration have found that immigrants who maintain meaningful connections with both their original culture and their new community often report stronger well-being, greater confidence, and healthier social relationships. True integration is not about erasing identity. It is about expanding it. After the event ended, dozens of people stayed behind. Not to ask grammar questions. Not to request vocabulary lists. Instead, they wanted to tell their own stories. One woman proudly described traditional bread from her country. A college student shared photographs of family celebrations. Another man talked about teaching his neighbors how to cook a recipe that had belonged to his grandmother for more than 60 years. Listening to them, I realized something beautiful. Everyone carries a story worth sharing. Many people simply need permission to tell it. One young father approached me while holding his little son's hand. My English is still very basic, he admitted. I worry that my son will become embarrassed by my accent. I knelt slightly, so his son could hear our conversation too. Then I asked the little boy a question. Are you proud of your dad? The child answered immediately. Yes. Why? He makes the best soup. The father laughed. So, that's my greatest achievement? The little boy nodded enthusiastically. And he tells funny bedtime stories. Children measure people differently than adults. They remember kindness long before perfection. As we talked, I suddenly remembered reading bedtime stories to my own daughter years earlier. Some evenings I stumbled over difficult words. Sometimes I paused to explain new vocabulary. Occasionally, I even mispronounced something. Yet my children never cared. They remembered sitting together. They remembered laughing. They remembered feeling safe. Educational researchers consistently emphasize that emotional connection dramatically improves learning and memory. Whether children are learning language or adults are developing confidence, positive emotional experiences strengthen long-term retention far more effectively than fear or embarrassment. A few weeks after the event, I received an email from one of the attendees. She wrote that she had finally introduced homemade food from her country during an office lunch. She expected awkward silence. Instead, coworkers asked questions, shared stories, requested recipes, exactly as mine had years earlier. Reading her message made me smile. Kindness spreads quietly. Curiosity spreads quietly. Courage spreads quietly too. None of them make loud headlines. Yet they transform lives every single day. That evening, Rachel found me smiling at my laptop. Good news. The best kind. I told her about the email. She listened carefully before laughing. So, what? I guess Balut has inspired another family. I laughed. Maybe. She shook her head.
No.
I'm pretty sure it wasn't the egg. What was it then? She looked at me with the same gentle smile that first welcomed me at the backyard barbecue years ago. It was someone brave enough to tell the story behind it. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Sometimes the truest answers arrive quietly. Later that night, our children joined us on the back porch. The summer air felt warm. Fireflies floated across the yard. Our daughter leaned against my shoulder.
Dad.
Yes. If someone is afraid to speak English, what should they do? I looked up at the stars before answering.
Speak anyway.
She smiled. Even if they make mistakes? Especially then. Because every friendship I treasure, every memory I cherish, every lesson I have learned, every dream that became reality, every smile around our family dinner table, And every beautiful chapter of this incredible journey began not with perfect English, but with one imperfect conversation that I almost never had. One egg, one story, one beautiful life. If you have listened to this story from the beginning, you may think it was always about Balut. Or perhaps you believe it was really about learning English in America. Maybe you think it became a love story somewhere in the middle. The truth is even simpler than all of those ideas. This story has always been about one quiet decision. The decision to stay curious instead of afraid. That single choice transformed an ordinary office lunch into lifelong friendships, turned a backyard barbecue into the beginning of my marriage, helped two families become one, gave our children the gift of growing up with two cultures, and eventually inspired countless English learners to believe that their imperfect voices still deserve to be heard. Looking back now, I realize something extraordinary. My life was never changed by one giant miracle. It was changed by hundreds of tiny moments that almost seemed too small to notice. And perhaps, without realizing it, your own story is waiting inside one of those tiny moments today. Sometimes, late in the evening after the children have gone to bed, Rachel and I still sit quietly on our back porch. The neighborhood is peaceful. The stars slowly appear above us. Soft summer winds move gently through the trees. Everything feels wonderfully ordinary. Those ordinary evenings have become some of my favorite memories. Rachel smiles at me. You know what I still can't believe?
What?
You almost didn't bring Balut to work. I laugh every single time. I know. You almost stayed home with your lunch. I know. You almost missed everything. She doesn't need to explain what everything means. Everything means our life, our family, our children, our friends, our memories. Sometimes the biggest difference between two futures is one small decision that lasts less than 30 seconds. Psychologists often describe this as the compound effect of small choices. Tiny decisions rarely seem important in the moment, yet over months and years they create completely different lives. One conversation leads to one friendship. One friendship leads to one opportunity. One opportunity leads to another. Looking backward, the path looks obvious. Walking forward, it simply feels like taking one small step. One Sunday afternoon, our daughter asked if we could watch old family videos together. We opened a box filled with memories.
Wedding photographs.
Birthday parties. Holiday dinners. Camping trips. School performances. Vacation adventures. Then we found a short video from years ago. It showed our backyard filled with laughter. My boss was standing near the grill. Rachel was smiling beside me. Our families were eating together. Someone in the background jokingly shouted, "Who wants another Balut?" Everyone laughed. Our son looked at the screen with wide eyes. That's where the famous story happened? I smiled. Part of it. He thought carefully. So, was that lunch lucky? I shook my head.
No.
What was it then? It was brave. He nodded slowly. Children often understand difficult ideas through simple words. Bravery, kindness,
Sharing.
listening. Those ideas are easier to remember than complicated theories. As the years continued passing, people often invited me to speak about language learning, cultural understanding, and adapting to life in America. Many expected complicated advice, secret learning methods, advanced vocabulary techniques, perfect pronunciation tips. Instead, I usually began with the same sentence. Tell people your story. At first, audiences often looked surprised. Then I explained. Stories create connection. Connection creates conversation. Conversation builds confidence. Confidence improves language. Language opens opportunities. The process is beautifully simple. Educational research consistently shows that meaningful communication strengthens long-term language development far more effectively than isolated memorization. People remember vocabulary connected to emotions, experiences, and relationships because the brain naturally stores meaningful information more deeply than disconnected facts. One evening after a community workshop, a teenage student quietly approached me. "I have something for you." He handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a short letter. It read, "I stopped speaking English because I was embarrassed by my accent. After hearing your story, I introduced myself to a new classmate today. We talked for 15 minutes. It wasn't perfect, but it was real.
Thank you.
I folded the letter carefully, not because it was written perfectly, because it reminded me of myself. Years earlier, someone had unknowingly done exactly the same thing for me.
My boss.
He never gave me a motivational speech. He never became my English teacher. He simply chose curiosity instead of judgment. Sometimes that is enough to change another person's life forever. Researchers studying positive psychology have found that seemingly small acts of encouragement often create lasting increases in confidence because they reshape how people view themselves. One sincere moment of acceptance can become a reference point the brain returns to whenever fear appears again. That idea continues inspiring me every single day. Years later, our children became teenagers. Our daughter spoke both languages naturally. Our son proudly introduced friends to foods from both cultures. Sometimes they laughed about which traditions belonged to which grandparents. Sometimes they mixed recipes together just to create something completely new. Watching them grow reminded me that cultures are not walls. They are bridges. Strong bridges become even stronger every time someone chooses to cross them. One autumn evening, our entire family gathered for dinner. My parents had traveled to visit us. Rachel's parents were already there. My former boss and his wife joined us too. The table was full, just as it had been years earlier. American barbecue, traditional family dishes, fresh bread, homemade desserts, and yes, one carefully prepared ballot. My boss looked at everyone and laughed. "I suppose this has become tradition." "It certainly has," Rachel answered. He raised his glass. "I'd like to make one final toast." The room became quiet. "To curiosity." He smiled warmly. "Because curiosity gave me a new friend." He looked toward Rachel. "It gave someone a wonderful husband." He looked toward our children. "It gave two amazing kids a family filled with two cultures." Then he looked at me. And somehow, he laughed softly. One little egg managed to bring all of us together. Everyone smiled. No one argued, because everyone knew it was never really about the egg. It was about opening a door that fear wanted to keep closed. As dinner ended and everyone laughed together beneath the warm evening lights, I quietly looked around the table. The people I loved most in the world were sitting together. Different backgrounds, different childhoods, different traditions, different first languages. Yet somehow, one family. That is the greatest lesson my journey has ever taught me. Learning English is not simply about mastering grammar. It is not only about memorizing vocabulary. It is not about sounding exactly like someone else. Learning English is about creating opportunities to understand people you might never have met otherwise. It is about discovering stories hidden behind unfamiliar faces. It is about replacing fear with curiosity. It is about realizing that every conversation is a bridge waiting to be crossed. And if one ordinary lunch, one unusual meal, one brave boss, one heartfelt conversation, one unexpected invitation, and one imperfect English learner could build a life filled with friendship, love, family, and hope, Imagine what one small act of courage might begin in your own life tomorrow. Before you leave today, I want to ask you one simple question. What is the one conversation you're avoiding because you're afraid your English isn't good enough? Maybe it's introducing yourself to a new coworker. Maybe it's ordering food without translating every sentence in your head. Maybe it's saying hello to someone you've wanted to meet for months. Or maybe it's simply believing that your voice deserves to be heard. Here's what my journey taught me. My life did not change because my English suddenly became perfect. It changed because one ordinary day, I stopped waiting for perfection and started choosing courage. One lunch became a friendship. One friendship became love. One love became a family. One family became a life I could never have imagined. And it all started with one small decision to say, this is who I am. So, if you ever feel embarrassed by your accent, if you ever forget a word, if you ever make a grammar mistake, please don't stop speaking, because people may forget your mistakes, but they will always remember your kindness, your story, and your courage. Every sentence you practice today is building the life you'll live tomorrow. Every conversation is another bridge. Every new word is another open door. And maybe, just maybe, your next simple English conversation will become the beginning of the greatest chapter of your life. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story encouraged you, helped you practice slow English listening, slow English reading, and everyday English conversation, please support this channel. Like this video if you want more real-life English stories. Leave a comment below. What is one food from your culture that you would proudly share with the world? I read as many comments as I can, and your story might inspire someone from another country. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new slow English story designed to help you improve your English naturally through meaningful, emotional, and inspiring real-life experiences. Share this video with a friend, an English learner, or someone who simply needs a little courage today. Until our next story, keep listening,
Keep speaking.
keep smiling, keep staying curious, because every beautiful journey begins with one brave conversation.